we move from language to number with the world's specialist of number mechanisms in the brain, Andreas Nieder. Andreas is a professor of animal physiology at the University of Tübingen in Germany, where he's also the director of the Institut of neurobiology. I first met Andreas when I was I had published my book called The Number Sense, and I went to MIT a few years later. I went to Harvard, actually, to visit Liz, and I heard that there was this extraordinary work, which was done by Earl Miller and Andreas Nieder, just next door at MIT, that they were finding some number neurons. And with Jean-Pierre, we had made this proposal in 1993 that there should be neurons that are tuned to numbers, and they could encode what we know about the number sense. So I rushed to MIT. I remember very well the first time we met. I rushed to your office, and I think we said hello and so on, but mostly we looked at the screen, and this was my first glimpse of the number neurons, which you've been exploring afterwards so beautifully. So this is my memory of how we met, but I look forward to hearing more about numerical cognition explored with direct recordings from inside the brain. The title has changed slightly, but thank you very much. Help me welcome.
Thank you, Stan. It's really a great honor to be here among the splendid selection of speakers to celebrate your 60th birthday. I'm looking forward to the next 60 years and your ideas. I know Stan now for 23 years, as you've just heard. Whenever I bump into him and I talk to him, I have the impression that his brain is ticking away with a frequency twice as high as my own, which is very humbling. Maybe some of you also have this experience. He has beautiful ideas over the last centuries and continues to have them. He's an extremely creative mind. And last but not least, he's also courageous enough to test these ideas. And this is what makes him special. And I'm really looking forward to more ideas. Of course, as a student of numerical representations, I was reading very early on his famous book, The Number Sense. Hugely inspiring. I can still recommend it today, even though it's a little older now. And when I closed the book, I had the impression that, oh my God, everything has been done. He knows everything. What is there left to be doing? Until I realized that there's maybe a little niche open, and this was about single neuron correlates of the number sense, and this is where I try to squeeze in. Everything you will hear today from me is about single neurons and populations of single neurons. The talk is in 2 chapters. The first chapter is about monkeys, non-human primates, and the second part is about human primates. These are the recordings that I'm doing in a beautiful collaboration with my colleague Florian Moormann, also sitting here talking on Friday. Don't miss him. My lab has 2 animal models. One is the rhesus monkeys, and I will talk about these guys today. The other one are corvids, crows, fascinating birds, numerically on par with primates, I can tell you, I can assure you. Unfortunately, I don't have time to talk about them today because I will be wearing my primate hat. And as I said, I will talk about human recordings together with Florian Moormann. Now, when we talk about animals like monkeys, you may think, this is strange to investigate the number sense, because monkeys, after all, like all animals, do not have a symbolic understanding of numbers. And numbers, after all, are our symbols in order to represent quantity. However, there are several lines of evidence indicating that what is happening in our brain when we get formal education is based on a very ancient evolutionary system that helps us to understand numerical quantity. One line of research, including beautiful work from Stan together with Pierre Picard, comes from indigenous people, and you see on this world map here, indigenous people that have been studied around the world, these red dots. People who live in cultures that have not evolved or developed a formal mathematical system. So sometimes it's called, they have a one-to-many system. So they have words for 1 and 2, and then something for 3-ish, 4-ish, 5-ish, but not much more. However, they can still represent numerical quantity. They can estimate numerical quantity, meaning that there's something in our brain that gives us this semantic information of what a quantity is already before we learn to count as children in our culture. Then there is ample evidence from developmental psychology. I'm, of course, not going into the details because there are people sitting here who are much more skilled doing this work. Just mentioning that infants at a few hours after birth can already discriminate numerical quantity, and it's known by now that the precision with which these infants and children can discriminate numerical quantity is indicative, is predictive of their math skills later in school. And finally, working with animals, a while ago, I surveyed the literature to find what other people have found out, and it's very clear and very obvious that either in order to survive long enough to reproduce, animals in the wild spontaneously are using numerical information to arrive at informed decisions in foraging situations, in alarm situations, in competitive social situations, and so on. So without anyone being around training these animals, they use this information, meaning that it has a huge adaptation value for any biological organism to be able to discriminate numerical quantity, and that's probably the prime reason why we have it in the first place. Now I'm starting with our monkey work. The protocol that all our monkeys are trained on initially and how we started is a delayed match to sample task or a delayed match to numerosity task. The monkey sitting in a darkened booth is grabbing a manipulendum in order to indicate to the computer, now I'm ready to work. And the computer is then showing a fixation stimulus. As you can see here, the monkeys have to fixate in the central dot. Then a sample stimulus appears, cueing the animal for a certain number of dots. In this case, the number is 4. Then the animal has to memorize in working memory for a brief period what it has just seen. So this allows us to also investigate working memory representations. And then a test stimulus appears that in 50% of the cases is a match, 4, as you can see, and then the animal has been trained to release the manipulendum to indicate that it has seen twice in a row the same numerosity. It's a matching task. In the other 50% of the cases, the test stimulus is a non-match, 3, and then the animal should recognize that this differs from the sample stimulus, not releasing the manipulendum and wait until the second test appears, which then will always be a match. So the animals, if they're working properly here, work better than 50%, ideally up to 100%. We are very aware that whenever we change the number of the dots on the screen, we are inevitably also changing other non-numerical visual parameters of the display, and we do everything in order to control or to equalize these parameters to really make sure that the animals are discriminating the number of dots and nothing else. And this is a selection of our control stimuli. I'm not going into the detail, just want to tell you that we are aware, and after training, neither the animals in their behavior care about these non-numerical stimuli, and most of the neurons don't care about this anymore. 2 slides with behavioral data. How does the behavior of the monkeys look like? It's an estimation representation. We call it an approximate number system that is working here. This data slide shows you the response frequency of a monkey plotted against the number of items that we tested from 1 to 8 here. And this orange dot here would be the match trials whenever we present 4 as a sample and 4 as a match stimulus. And the monkeys indicate in about 90% of the cases that they are recognizing that 4 is equaling 4. More informative, however, are the errors that the animals make for the non-matches, so the deviant numerosities. And here you see that they make, in 60% of the cases, they judge 3 dots as being 4. And in even 70% of the cases, they judge 5 dots as being 4. So here they make a lot of errors because they cannot discriminate these numerosities precisely as we would when we use our symbolic counting system. This is a function of their estimation system, but you also see that the errors are becoming less and less the more distant the deviant numerosities are from the matching numerosity. And this is giving rise to one of the classic effects, the so-called numerical distance effect, that even we humans show when we are symbolically counting, of course, to a much lesser extent. We are not only testing numerosity 4, but a broad range of numerosities. These are all the monkeys' behavioral performance functions. And you see these characteristic bell-shaped functions. If you look very closely, you will see for higher numerosities, the functions are becoming broader and broader. And this is giving rise to the second very well-known phenomenon, the so-called numerical size effect, meaning that at a given numerical distance, it's becoming harder and harder to discriminate numerical quantities if their magnitude is increasing. If you look even closer, you may see that the functions are not entirely symmetric. They are becoming symmetric on a logarithmically scaled number line. I'm not showing the data, but we've quantified this. We see this regularly. I'm hugely convinced that without our symbolic training, the numerical number line is logarithmic, and I think Stan is also on this page. Now, if we make these kinds of decisions, same, different number, and so on and so forth, we humans have, it's basically two ways of dealing with this. We can ponder about it for a long time, or we can make our decision very quickly, very rapidly. Kahneman called this thinking fast and slow. So what this means when we have to make decisions very quickly is that we rely on heuristics or cognitive biases, mental shortcuts that help us to deal with the situation very quickly. And we see these mental biases also in magnitude discriminations. And one of the best known effects is the regression to the mean effect. If you imagine you have the response rate plotted here against the target number, if we would respond very quickly, we would see that our judgments are zoomed into the center of the distribution of this number line in this case. And we were wondering whether this is a specific human phenomenon or whether maybe this is deeply rooted in our evolutionary history already. So we were testing our monkeys and we were looking more closely into the details, and we see that our monkeys, and actually also the crows, but I'm not showing you the data, show also these heuristics. They show a regression to the mean. They judge small numbers as being more similar to 5 compared to the larger numbers, higher than 5, that they also judge as being similar to 5. So this tells us that, and we modeled this based on Bayes' theorems, this regression explains, or the theorem explains the regression to the mean as a priors pulling extreme numbers toward the average. So this, of course, depends on prior information that the monkeys have. We are training the animals in order to be able to record from their neurons while they are engaged in these tasks, and we are focusing on the fundus of the interparietal sulcus, an area that's called ventral interparietal area, VIP. It's a classical association area where multimodal information converges, where all sorts of cognitive functions are represented. And the other area is our highest executive function center. It's the prefrontal cortex in a primate brain. And what we find are indeed a certain selection of neurons that are specifically tuned to numerical quantity. And I brought you two such examples. This is a neuron tuned to numerosity 2. The top part is a dot raster histogram. Every line represents a trial. Every dot represents an action potential. And all these numerosities here have been represented several times. And I hope you can see, based on the density of the dots here, that this neuron discharges very heavily in the sample period and also a little bit in the memory delay period. When we plot the same data as spike density histograms here, you see that nothing spectacular is happening during the pure fixation time. Why would they? But as soon as the sample stimulus appears, this neuron discharges very beautifully to numerosity 2. It discharges highest to numerosity 2. That's why we call this neuron to be tuned to numerosity 2. And then it gradually decays in discharge for numerosity 4, 1, and so on, all the adjacent numerosities. And this gives rise to tuning functions, very much like in the sensory systems and in the motor systems, peak-shaped tuning functions. This neuron is tuned, as I said, to 2, and it is also nicely tuned to numerosity 2 during the delay when the monkey has to memorize what it has just seen. Just to show you one other type of neuron, this neuron is nicely tuned to numerosity 6. And here, so for every numerosity we've tested, and so far we've tested up to 30, we find one or the other neuron that is tuned to this numerosity. Individually, the neurons would not be able to encode all the numbers the monkey is dealing with, but the population of neurons together would, of course, be able to represent the entire number line. This is our contribution to computational neuroscience. A few years back, we were wondering whether a deep learning network would also be able to represent number. And in this case, we trained this network, convolutional neural network, only to represent visual objects, not numbers, so it was totally naive to number. But the surprising finding was that many of these neurons, artificial neurons, at the end of the day, were nicely and beautifully able to represent number, just like real neurons. And there are two messages from that. A, these networks are extremely powerful, and they represent probably many more features than we think. And second, And this corresponds with our finding that we do not have to train the animals in order to find numerosity selective neurons. Even if the animals are naive, and we've never trained them to discriminate numerosities, we find a significant proportion of neurons in the brains of these animals that are representing number. And this gives rise to the idea that a big portion of our number sense is really innately present without learning or prior to learning. What we find is if we then train the animals to discriminate numerosities, the neurons are becoming better, they're becoming sharper and more selective, and more neurons are kicking in. So the system is becoming emphasized, but it is already in place before learning and experience happens. When Stan visited me in Earl Miller's lab 23 years ago, we talked about the data and we talked about the recordings, and I told him that I recorded for a long time. This is a monkey brain, left is anterior, in the superficial parts of the posterior parietal cortex, and didn't really find a lot of neurons there and was quite frustrated. And only when I really moved the electrode deep down into the fundus of the intraparietal sulcus, then a large proportion of neurons were visible. And he just listened to me and said very briefly, I could have told you. Right? So this was the information that he had already from the human investigations. The lesson for me was, since then, whenever we do a new project, I always ask myself, where would Stan place the recording electrode? And this turned out to be very advantageous for me since then. We find most of the neurons now in this area, ventral intraparietal area, which is a real hotspot, as you can see, about 20% of randomly selective neurons, and another area is the prefrontal cortex, where we typically find slightly more neurons engaged in numerical processing. We find that the neurons in VIP respond earlier to numerical information, indicating that this is probably the first site in the brain where this information is encoded, and then routed forward to the prefrontal cortex. And we have recent evidence based on canonical correlation analysis that we do from simultaneously recorded neurons, that really during the sample period, VIP is feeding forward information to the prefrontal cortex. During the working memory delay, however, this is not so clear, and obviously these two areas are talking to back and forth to one another. Of course, we are working in non-human primates because we think we are contributing also to knowledge what's happening in our own brain. So the big question is this somehow related to what's happening in our brain? This is a beautiful picture from one of Stan's meta-analysis, about 30 functional imaging studies where humans discriminate numerosity, do mental calculation, work with numbers, and so on and so forth. And you see these yellow areas here. These are the areas where all of these studies find activation, functional imaging activation, BALD activation. And you see very clearly the posterior parietal and parts of the frontal prefrontal cortex are always becoming activated. And if you compare this with the monkey data, I think it's very obvious that this is an evolutionary ancient system that we find in a non-human primate. If some of these lesions, particularly the posterior parietal cortex, is damaged, and you see this based on this shading here in this patient, the patients often develop very specific deficits in dealing with numbers, while language functions are still spared, indicating that the number system is really a separate system compared to the language system, at least before formal education. When we talk about enumeration or real counting, we actually talk about a sequential process. When we count, we do 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on and so forth. And we wondered whether we could also find neurons that are encoding these types of sequentially presented numbers. And in addition, we were wondering whether these neurons would integrate across visual and auditory information. Because if you think about numbers, you would like to have such neurons to be abstract encoders across different modalities. So we trained our monkeys to discriminate or to enumerate dots 1 to 4 in the sample period. And in the same session in other trials, sounds, so like beep, 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 and the animal had to match it to 3 dots in the display. And in the prefrontal cortex, not in the posterior parietal cortex, interestingly, but in prefrontal cortex, we find neurons that are beautifully tuned to numbers and simply do not care about the modality, whether it's visual or auditory, it's all the same for them. They are tuned to, and here are 4 representative neurons to 1, 2, 3, or 4 items in a row. So these neurons are presenting number in a supramodal way, if you like. When we have numbers in the brain, of course, it's not sufficient to simply represent it, but we want to work with them. So this is what we are doing more recently. Here we trained animals to compare 2 numerosities and make a same versus different judgment. And I call this an abstract decision because after the 2 numerosities have been displayed, the animal has to wait during a working memory period for a rule cue, and only the rule cue is informing the animal whether or not it has to make a movement. So this allows us to discriminate or to separate a movement preparatory activity from an abstract decision process. And what we find in the prefrontal cortex is that the groups of neurons are representing all of the relevant factors in the task. This measure here, omega square, is a measure of information contained in the neuronal population. I'm not going into the detail. For different factors that are important in the task, and you see initially the neurons are representing the first numerosity, then the second numerosity, and after a while they're also representing this abstract decision. So these neurons show a sequential and dynamic transfer of neuronal activity for numbers and for the abstract decision, and you've seen similar images from Liping Wang before. We can plot them in an abstract high-dimensional space in subspaces, and then we see that the same different decisions are dynamically segregated in these geometric subspaces, which allows the brain to flexibly deal with these decisions and the numbers that are involved. The most recent protocol, and the one I'm really proud about that we managed to train 2 animals on. And I am proud because this is probably the most complex task that we've ever tried so far. I briefly guide you through this. So the monkey is again sitting in the booth, and then it is seeing a certain number of dots, 3 in this case. And after a waiting period that we call the motor planning, the monkey is supposed to do as many hand movements as numbers of dots as it had seen in this instruction stimulus. So in this case, the animal is doing 1, 2, 3 manipulandum releases. And at the end of the hand movements, it has to tell us whether it's done with a counting sequence by making an eye movement to a confirmation stimulus. It's like pressing the enter key in the keyboard, if you like. So it's not enough for them to simply move the hands away, but they really have to tell us when they are done. We are presenting the instruction stimulus not only as numbers of dots, but also as Arabic numerals that the animals have learned to associate with this instruction stimulus or with a numerical value. And we had shown in recordings before that if the animals are trained to combine these 2 stimulus, the neurons do not care anymore about whether it's numbers of dots or whether it's Arabic numerals. They only care about the numerical value. And last but not least, if you see this kind of movements, you may wonder, well, if the animal is making 4 hand movements, this is about twice the time as when the animal is making only 2 movements. And maybe the animal is timing in this task rather than counting. We are very aware of this problem, and we had temporal protocols in place that told the animal when it was allowed to make a single hand movement, and with this temporal controls, we could destroy any temporal patterning that the animal could have used, again, in order to make sure that it's really counting the number of hand movements. And I'm later focusing for the moment on this motor planning period. The animals can do this. We see exactly the same behavioral performance functions. And in this planning period, we see neurons that are beautifully tuned to the different impending numbers that the animal has to make with his hands. So this is 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. When we train a statistical classifier in a decoding method with a population of selective neurons, then the classifier can nicely and above chance predict what the number of impending hand movements would be. And not only that, that it can predict the correct number of movements, it can only predict whether the animal is making an error in the number of impending hand movements, so before the animal is really starting to count. And it can not only predict whether it's making an error, but it can also predict whether the animal is making 1 movement too few or 1 too many. And this is presented here by this classifier performance that you see here. And all of this is actually very convincing, at least to me, that the neurons are encoding the impending number of movements. The second part of my talk here, now I switch over to the collaboration with Florian Moormann. This is Florian Moormann and our PhD student Esther Kutter. One of the rare possibilities to record from the human brain single-cell activity invasively is to work with human patients. In this case, these are epilepsy patients. And for medical treatment, they are getting electrodes implanted, and only if they give us the written consensus that they are participating in a scientific study before the entire diagnostic treatment is concluded, then we can record this data while the patients are waiting in their bed until these measurements are being concluded. So here are these different electrodes. In our case, they are implanted in the medial temporal lobe, areas like the hippocampus, parahippocampal cortex. Why is this area still interesting for us in terms of number? I told you about the posterior parietal cortex and the prefrontal cortex so far, but it turns out that over the years there's also a lot of evidence from children in particular that if we learn by rote certain calculation procedures like multiplication tables, for instance, medial temporal lobe areas like the hippocampus are becoming activated. So there was reason for us to believe that this kind of information could also be represented in the medial temporal lobe areas. One protocol we did was a very simple, and this is again a reference to Stan Dehaene, parity judgment task. Many of you may remember that the discovery of the snark effect happened with the parity judgment task 1993. So a while back. So we asked our patients to do this parity judgment task. All they had to do is to judge whether the numbers of dots was even or odd, nothing more. But this made sure that they were paying attention. And indeed, in the human brain, we found the same type of neurons that were beautifully tuned to numerical information. This is one neuron from the entorhinal cortex that is nicely tuned to the number 3, as you can see, based on the tuning function here. This is a different example neuron in the hippocampus that is nicely tuned to numerosity 7, as you can see here, in the same peak shape function that we've seen before in the monkey, indicating that this is really a very basic numerical code that both monkeys and humans are carrying around in their brain. When we talk about small numbers, and usually we are investigating small numbers, there pops up the question whether we are really dealing with one numerical systems or two numerical systems. And the idea is, for instance, that small numbers up to 4 are represented by a separate system. It's often called a subitizing system. And this idea of a subitizing system goes about 150 years back to a guy called Jevons, who published in Nature 150 years back. It's a very interesting study because it's one subject and it's himself who is doing behavior, and at that time he was still able to publish this in Nature. But he got something very right. He discovered something very right. He describes that he picked some beans with his hand and threw them casually into a cardboard box and then counted the number of beans very rapidly. And what he realized is, and this is now the actual number of beans plotted against the number of estimated beans, that he never made an error when he counted 3 or 4 beans, but from 5 on, he made some significant errors, giving rise to this estimation, to this approximate number system. And since then, there is this idea out there that there is some sort of a boundary, a representational boundary between small numbers and higher numbers beyond 4. I never believed in the system because I never saw it in our animals until we did these recordings in humans. And what we saw in the human recordings, and here I present 4 neurons from medial temporal lobe, is that whenever we looked at the neurons that were encoding small numbers or were tuned to small numbers, they showed the significant sideband suppression. So the non-preferred numerosities were suppressed relative to baseline activity in an active process. Whereas this did not happen for neurons that were tuned to numerosities 5 and higher. And for an electrophysiologist like myself, this is something I can understand. Obviously, there are 2 different mechanisms at work. So we looked more closely into this. This is an average plotting of all the neurons that are tuned to specific preferred numerosities, averaged and normalized. And I hope what you can see here is that the neurons that are tuned from 0 to 3 all go below baseline, which is the dotted line here. And this is not something that the neurons tuned to higher numerosities do. So we try to measure this in more detail by fitting Gauss functions, a standard normal distribution, to these tuning curves. And what we saw is that the amplitude of the fit plotted against the number of the number in the sample started to increase after around number 4, not before. And even more importantly, the sigma of the Gauss fit, which is a measure of the width of the tuning function, of the selectivity of the tuning function, also stayed constant and very selective for numbers up to 3 and 4, and only then it gradually increased. So this indicated that maybe there is really some kind of boundary between 4 and 5. We tested this with also with a population decoding analysis. This is a state space analysis. In this case, the activity of a population of neuron at any moment in the trial is represented by an n-dimensional vector in an n-dimensional space, and n here means the number of neurons. So in this case, we had 120 neurons, meaning that we had a 120 neuron dimensional vector, which is, of course, something that we cannot visualize anymore. So what people are doing is they reduce the dimensions to 3 dimensions, and then we can see them in 3-dimensional space. And this is then giving rise to these trajectories that are meandering in this abstract space for the different numerosities, as you can see here. And we use this kind of plotting, so the absolute position of the trajectories is meaningless, but the distance between these trajectories is meaningful, because the more distant they are, the more the population is discriminating between these two factors that we are investigating. We were wondering whether we can quantify that there are really more than one population of tuned neurons in our recordings by plotting these trajectories in 2 dimensions, in different 2 dimensions, doing an optimal cluster number analysis with 2 methods. Both methods told us that the optimal number of clusters in these recordings is 2, which was already nice. So the next step then for us was to do a k-means clustering and looking for the optimal boundary. And it turned out that the boundary is between 4 and 5. Again, exactly where you would expect it based on the idea that there's a subitizing system and an approximate number system. What we do not know exactly what's the mechanism behind this. We have some ideas that it could be related to attention, and this is what we want to test now in different model systems. And based on this finding, it's probably not an accident that all the ancient numeral systems in different cultures, even though they did not have any contact with one another, have the first 3 or the first 4 numbers represented by the actual number of tokens, because we can very rapidly instantaneously extract the numerical value. Recordings in humans have, of course, the advantage that we cannot only record non-numerical quantity, but also real number symbols. And this is what we did in a slightly different protocol. We asked the patients to do a very humble mathematical operation, an addition or a subtraction, both with numbers of dots or with Arabic numerals, and we represented the calculation rule in 2 different ways, either with the symbols or with words. And I'm focusing first on the presentation period, on the sample period of the operand 1, with the question, would we find neurons that are abstractly encoding numerical information, irrespective of whether we are showing the patient's numbers of dots or the Arabic numerals? To cut a long story short, this is not the case. It was much to my disappointment, because I was really hoping for these very abstract number encoders. What we do find is that the neurons are either representing numerical quantity in the dot patterns or in the Arabic numerals, but not both at the same time. The good message, however, is that we do find neurons that are tuned to numerical values in these symbolic displays in the medial temporal lobe. This is something that I would not expect in a monkey, because a monkey is not a symbolic species. But these are separated populations. Currently, we have no idea whether this is a feature of the medial temporal lobe, whether it may change if we could record in the posterior parietal lobe, but this is something that one has to investigate in the future. And finally, and this is the last part, we were interested in the calculation procedure itself, the addition and the subtraction. would we find signals, would we find neurons that are indicative of what operation the patients would perform? And the answer is yes, even in the medial temporal lobe, even though this area is commonly not associated with working memory, executive functions, rule-specific types of information, there are certain and significantly more than chance beautiful neurons that are encoding the abstract calculation rule. This is a neuron that is encoding the addition rule, irrespective of whether we cue the addition rule by a plus or by a word. This is what the two different colors mean. And here is a neuron that is most activated whenever the patients are performing a subtraction, again, irrespective of whether we cue the subtraction by a minus, by a little minus sign, or by a word. So these neurons are responding in a very abstract, notation-independent way to the calculation rule. When we train a classifier on this information, and now I'm focusing on the parahippocampal cortex and the hippocampus, because these were the two areas that were most interested in numerical information, the classifier in this time period where the calculation rule comes up has no problem based on the neuronal population to decode the correct calculation that the patients would perform. The classifier can also correctly decode the calculation plus or minus, irrespective of the notation. And finally, we were interested in the type of code that we see there represented. So the idea is that in working memory, there are two basic codes represented by neurons. One is the classic static code, where neurons that are sustained, active to a specific feature that the animal or the human keeps in working memory, shows this sort of tuning throughout the entire delay period for as long as it has to remain in working memory. And the second code, called the dynamic code, is thought to be based on neurons that are responding very transiently, very briefly to specific information. But a few hundred milliseconds later, they may encode something very different. This can be decoded with cross-temporal classifier approaches, cross-temporal decoding approaches, where a classifier is trained on an initial brief part of the trial and then tested in a later part, in our case of the calculation period. And what we find is that in parahippocampal cortex, we only find accuracy values along the diagonal, meaning that here we are dealing with the so-called dynamic code based on these transiently active neurons, whereas in the hippocampus, the picture is very different. We get this kind of characteristic square-like arrangement of accuracy values indicative of sustained tuned neurons. And so what we find here is that in these two areas, even though they're really next to one another, we have two very different calculation rule codes. That's the end. So I hope I could convince you that monkeys can represent numbers in an approximate way, that they have cognitive biases, and that cognitive biases and heuristics are probably evolutionary ancient and not just a feature of us, that we find number neurons in the posterior parietal cortex, in the intraparietal sulcus, and in the prefrontal cortex in these animals, and then that these neurons can also make a sensory to motor transfer of seen numbers to numbers of self-generated actions. In the humans, we find the same type of number selective neurons in the medial temporal lobe regions. We have reason to believe that they are representing two different systems, or two different mechanisms at least, for representing small versus larger numbers. We find two different populations of neurons that are either representing non-symbolic number as opposed to symbolic number. And finally, there are also lots of beautiful rule-selective neurons that are representing plus and minus addition and subtraction operations. Thank you very much.